Well, that was a great intro to this podcast. Ben Carter.
That can't be the intro.
Hello, friends, and welcome to episode 36 of From the Van. It's a podcast from my van, where I have conversations with people who have relationships with residential vehicles. I'm your host, Marty Benson, and today's episode features Ben Carter. Ben Carter is the Senior Litigation Attorney at the Kentucky Equal Justice Center. He's also a longtime college friend of mine, and he is now married to one of my best friends, who's also a longtime good college friend of mine. We got to see them and their family when we passed through Louisville, Kentucky this year. And when he came out to San Diego for a conference, I convinced him to come on the podcast to talk about equity, housing, and his work at the Equal Justice Center. One of the reasons, despite the fact that he doesn't have a relationship with a residential vehicle, one of the reasons that I thought that this was going to be a really wonderful and dynamic conversation is because he has interesting perspectives on affordable housing and equity in general. And sure enough, during the course of the conversation, he sort of changed the way that I think about the potential longevity of the hashtag van life movement or nomadic movement or whatever you want to call it, and also the prudence and reasons behind implementing tiny houses, which if you've been listening to all of the podcasts, you probably already know I didn't really have a good attitude about, and I think that he made me a lot more optimistic about tiny houses, so that was cool. He also introduced me to the term micro-mobility, so please enjoy episode 36 of From the Van featuring Ben Carter to find out what that word means.
Let's see. The Center for Budget and Policy Priorities has gathered a group of people together to learn about SNAP and how to expand and strengthen SNAP benefits in all 50 states.
Okay. And SNAP is basically food stamps.
Yep.
Right, is what we're talking
exactly.
about.
Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program.
Okay. And you're here because of your job at
Kentucky Equal Justice Center. So, SNAP is one part of the work that KEJC does in Kentucky. So we lobby in the legislature and, it's sort of courthouse and state house work. So when people don't do things the right way in Frankfurt, we sue them in the courthouse and hopefully we can get the changes we need made in Frankfurt.
Right. You are their senior litigation guy, but you're also doing lobbying. Are you guys you're a C4?
We're a C3.
Oh, you're a C3?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're what's called an unrestricted legal aid organization.
Okay.
So, most civil legal aid is done in America by organizations that get funding from the Legal Services Corporation. So when the federal government allocates money for civil legal aid, so tenant defense, debt collection abuse, representing victims of domestic violence and family matters, all the civil matters that people in poverty might face, the organizations that get money from Legal Services Corporation do that work. But when you get money from Legal Services Corporation, it comes with a lot of restrictions. So you can't do class actions. You can't lobby in the legislature. You can't represent prisoners. You can't represent people who are undocumented. So each state, more or less, has an organization like the one I work for, which accepts no money from Legal Services Corporation, but still does all the work that Legal Services Corporation funded organizations can't do.
Right.
Are restricted from doing. So we're unrestricted.
Yeah.
I was telling somebody last night, my favorite movie is Sneakers. There's a scene in Sneakers where
the early 90s hacker movie?
The early 90s hacker movie that is more relevant today than it was in the
I need to go back
90s.
And watch it.
It's so good.
I'm sorry. Continue your story.
It's so good. We can talk about that the entire podcast if you want to, Marty. I mean, it's like information security, Russian interference, like privacy, all of that stuff.
Nuts. Okay.
All wrapped up in like a great heist movie. So Sidney Poitier is looking at Robert Redford and he's explaining to him that in order to get the thing that they need to get to steal it back, Robert Redford is going to have to carry a box at a speed no greater than 2 inches per second across a room that they've heated up to 98.6 degrees, because there are temperature and motion sensors in the room. And he looks at him and says, "You get all the fun stuff." And that's how I feel about KEJC. Like, we get all the fun stuff.
Well, so that sounds super badass, because the organizations that I work with are limited, and so we're constantly sort of trying to figure out how to parry and like do stuff completely above board, but also use every tool at our disposal, right? But when you're talking about you're here on SNAP, you deal with housing stuff. How big your umbrella seems so freaking huge, man.
Yeah, it's overwhelming when I start thinking about all the things that we're trying to do.
Yeah.
And when you go to other states' pages, the websites of other states that have organizations like ours, and it's like they have a staff 3 to 4 times the size of KEJC.
How big are y'all?
We run what's called the Maxwell Street Legal Clinic. So that was originally a separate nonprofit that merged with KEJC.
Okay.
So they open and close 500 cases, immigration cases a year. And so we have a pretty full staff over there, 4 attorneys, 3 support staff essentially, and some part-time folks as well. The rest of the organization is our executive director, who wears about 15 hats. We have an outreach worker, a food justice organizer, a health law fellow, and a part-time workers' rights attorney.
Okay.
So in terms of like lawyers, it's the Maxwell Street folks, and then me, Betsy, who does our health law work, and then a part-time workers' rights attorney, who's also a legislator. Okay. So.
And you're in Louisville, not in Frankfurt.
Not in Frankfurt. So anyway, you were asking what the scope is, and it's basically all of the public benefits programs. So SNAP, temporary assistance for needy families, Medicaid. We're currently suing over Kentucky's worst in the nation practice of disenfranchising people with felony convictions. So there's about 400,000 people in Kentucky who can't vote because they have a felony conviction. And Kentucky's one of 2 states that permanently strips people of their voting rights. So we've partnered with the Fair Election Center to craft a challenge based in the First Amendment on that case, or on that practice. But that's a little bit outside of what we've traditionally done, which is all of the poverty law work that legal aid organizations can't do. So we work with legal aid organizations. We know who they are. We're friends with them. But it's, renters' rights work. It's affordable housing, foreclosure defense, consumer law. We run task forces around workers' rights, public benefits, health and welfare, and we also do family law stuff. So it's trying to keep track of everything that's happening in the legislature, trying to run task forces to help legal aid attorneys get best practices in their practices and the tools that they need to do the job for the direct services that they're providing to people. And then picking, just a few litigation opportunities that allow us to make a real big impact.
Wow. That is mind-boggling. Do you do this? Do you sort of limit yourself from doing the stuff that the legal aid organizations can do, because you have these you're sort of gloves off in other areas, and you just sort of help them facilitate the stuff that they do?
Yeah, we try to. Sort of, if we get a call from somebody who would qualify for legal aid's services, I mean, definitely they're the appropriate agency or organization to provide that assistance. They've got the systems in place. They're funded to do that work. There are occasionally some direct service cases that they can't do for whatever reason. undocumented people.
Right.
If you are undocumented, you just cannot get their help. So
in anything.
I got to try a case for a woman. It's small dollars in terms of what lawyers usually fight over, but it was $2,500 a month's work that she got stiffed, and so she didn't qualify for legal aid and needed that money. So we got to file suit because we have a workers' rights practice.
Right.
So we do some direct services work like that, and it's always fun to get to go to trial.
Sure.
But mostly, like, the big case we're working on right now is co-counseling with the National Health Law Program and the Southern Poverty Law Center to keep work requirements off the backs of people who get their health insurance through the Medicaid program. So Kentucky's governor, now outgoing governor, proposed doing this, asked for permission to impose what he called community engagement requirements on about 400,000 Kentuckians who get their health insurance through Medicaid.
And this is one of the reasons that he was pretty unpopular, right?
Yeah. Although he ran on that platform
Right.
and got elected, when people started to look at what the impact of those work requirements were going to be, not just for the 95,000 people who are going to lose Medicaid coverage, but for the providers who are no longer going to get paid for the work that they were doing, for the hospitals who are going to have to treat a lot of people where there's no payer on the other end of an uninsured person's, medical bill. And so, once people sort of got their heads around financially what that would mean for Kentucky's economy, you can look across the border in Tennessee that doesn't have expanded Medicaid. There are hospitals closing in the counties just across the border. And in Kentucky, rural people still have access to their hospitals because of expanded Medicaid. And I think, it's one thing to know that your neighbor has health insurance, but when your dad has a heart attack and is driven to the hospital that's still in business nearby rather than 50 minutes away down the interstate, that's a matter of life and death, whether you have Medicaid or not.
Sure.
Even if you have private insurance. And so there's a lot on the line, and people, it's frustrating to have to fight. And to be clear, like, I took this job a year ago after Anne Marie Reagan and Kara Stewart had started this litigation, and obviously InHelp and Southern Poverty Law Center have been crucial in this. So I often say, like, I'm sort of like a guy who was like asleep in a tree and a train was passing by, and like I fell into the train and like now it's pulling into the station and I'm getting off and like, acting like I've been there the whole time. I'm not, a lot of people did this work, but, it's frustrating to have had them work for as long as, and as hard as they have, and to continue to do that work just to keep the status quo. When we could have been spending our time and energy making Medicaid more effective in Kentucky, expanding coverage, making sure people who needed it got it. And we've been engaged in, 2 or 3 years of maintaining the status quo.
Right. Well, I want to move out like a little bit further to more macro politics and stuff. But first I want to talk about Kentucky, and we saw you there a couple of months ago.
Yeah.
And I thought you were going to shit yourself when I called Kentucky a purple state.
Yeah.
But I feel like in that pocket of Kentucky and West Virginia, and as you get into the Midwest, you have these communities that have turned red or reddish in the last 40 or 50 years, but have really suffered as a result of it, or as a result of Republican policies.
Yeah.
And they, at the end of the day, they're all pretty hardcore, middle class, pro-union sort of folks. So, what do you have to say about that? What is your perception of the Louisville's a very progressive city for Kentucky, I think. What's your what's your perception of the sort of political landscape of Kentucky? And the reason I ask that is because we go inland here for an hour and a half.
Right.
And it's not as much like the South and Kentucky is, in that I feel like people there are more interspersed with each other. And here there's an inland California and a coastal California, you know? But it's incredible to me that things can change geographically, politically with just geography so quickly. And you guys just got, I mean, you had a pretty unpopular governor, but you just got a Democrat in.
Official as of today.
Yeah.
They just recanvassed the vote, and nothing changed. I think there was one vote, one write-in candidate got one more or one fewer vote. So let me back up and say,
apologies for the filibuster just now. It was a very complex question.
Oh, no. I thought I was going to have to apologize for the filibuster for like some filibuster that Mitch McConnell did or something.
No.
No, it wasn't a filibuster, and I get what you're saying, but I want to be super clear. We're sitting in a van in San Diego. It's Marty and Ben, college friends.
Yeah.
Not Ben Carter, like speaking on behalf of KEJC.
Oh,
which
of course.
a 501c3 and so I'm just talking about my life and what it's like, working for the organization that I work for, and obviously none of what I have said or about to say I'm not speaking on behalf of KEJC here. And so, I think that in terms of trying to figure out Kentucky politics, a friend of mine, Joe Dunman, tweeted not long after the election, I've lived in Kentucky my whole life, and I've been pretty politically engaged for the last half of it, 20 years, and I do not understand Kentucky politics. And if you think you do, you're wrong, because there was a lot of hot takes after the election last week about what, Governor-elect Beshear's election might mean for, Donald Trump's prospects, for candidates who are running against Medicaid or whatever it might be. And they all seemed a little bit wrong.
Yeah.
Understandably so. There's an understandable inclination to want to read a lot into what happened in Kentucky, because in Kentucky, I think we came to understand in the aftermath of 2016 that our governor's election in 2015 had a lot of parallels to what happened nationally in 2016. You had sort of an upstart Tea Party candidate who was not popular with even a majority of his own party capture the primary by a very narrow margin. I mean, Matt Bevin won his primary by 81 votes, I think. And so you had somebody who won something like, 35-36% of the Republican primary vote going up against Jack Conway, who was a very establishment, credible, experienced Democratic candidate. Jack looks like he's from Central Casting in terms of what you would expect a politician to look like, and, or I should say a Kentucky, Southern Democrat politician. He had been AG, and I think everybody expected the establishment Democrat candidate to win pretty easily over somebody who had run against Mitch McConnell. Matt Bevin primaried Mitch McConnell and was not popular in his own party, and yet he won pretty handily in Kentucky in 2015. So I think because there were those parallels in 2015 and 2016, we're looking at 2019 and saying, what's it mean for 2020, right? And I'm not sure you can draw any conclusion other than the fact that Matt Bevin was not just an unpopular governor, he was the most unpopular governor. And I think his approval rating was 35%, Marty. And what I take away from last week's election is, the Democrats beat Matt Bevin America's least popular governor by 5,000 votes.
Mm-hmm.
And down ballot, Republicans won every statewide election handily. I don't think any of them were even close. And some of them were blowouts. And so, while Governor Beshear-elect's election means a lot for the Medicaid clients that I have who are going to get to keep Medicaid and not have to comply with some onerous work requirement. Mm-hmm. It appears, if Beshear keeps his promise, and we don't have any doubt that he will, but, it means a lot for those folks. It means a lot to the people who are going to have their voting rights restored after they've completed their sentence of a felony. And in Kentucky, like, stealing something worth a few $100s is a felony.
Wow.
And so and you can be sentenced to a year in prison and plead guilty to a felony and not serve much time at all.
Right.
But lose your voting rights.
Never get to vote again for the rest of your life.
Yeah. One of our clients wrote us and he said, my last conviction was when I was 25 years old. And I've lived without another conviction, a crime-free life for 40 years. He's 65 years old. And that's frustrating.
Yeah.
And it's a real voter disenfranchisement or felon disenfranchisement is something I learned about in law school back in 2004 and started caring about it and working on it. I had a radio show when I was in law school and had people who had their voting rights stripped because of a felony conviction, Navy veterans and things like that. And it's just one of those things where it's an outrage.
Yeah.
And so it means a lot. And we've always been very clear. I don't care whether somebody registers Democrat, Republican, Green Party, or whatever. If you've paid your debt to society, served your sentence, and are back, whether you, in my opinion, regardless of what you're convicted of. If you're convicted of a violent felony, you probably serve 30, 40 years in jail. Mm-hmm. If you've done your time, you served a longer sentence than somebody who stole an iPhone. Right? But if you've done the time that a judge and jury said that you ought to serve,
you should get to be a whole person
You
again.
should be welcomed back into society, and that means having your voting rights restored.
Yeah.
And the fact that Kentucky's one of two states that's so far behind in this is just really, it's a blight.
Yeah.
So that was a long way of filibustering your filibustery question, which is I think your question was really, what's it like living in a state where there were Democratic strongholds in Eastern Kentucky that have now flipped dramatically. I mean, I think Trump got 70% of the vote in some of these Eastern Kentucky counties, which used to be solidly Democratic. Yeah. It's a head scratcher, and I think it's a lot of different things.
So you're looking at the ballot now and you're like, well, yeah, Beshear beat the least popular governor ever, and everything else was down the line totally Republican. Is there a shift happening? Is there not a shift happening? Is there an opportunity in Kentucky?
No, I mean, I posted a tweet, something along the lines of, if you're looking at this race as anything but evidence that in 4 years we're going to have 30 years of GOP control of the state house and the governorship, you're missing the point. Because, I think I said something along the lines of the GOP demonstrated today, or demonstrated with this election, that as long as they don't run the most colossal
complete
asshole
idiot, yeah,
as a governor candidate, they can win handily.
Yeah,
they just have to have an empty suit to run,
right? As
far as I can tell. And so I wasn't saying that to I wasn't trying to suggest that the teachers hadn't worked hard, that the unions hadn't worked hard. Everybody worked hard to win what was a very important race, right? But Matt Bevin just barely lost.
Yeah. You're saying the hill is still real damn steep.
I'm saying, like, if you cannot read Beshear's election as some sort of change in the trend of growing GOP power in Kentucky. It's in my mind, it's a demonstration of the power that he lost so narrowly, being so deeply unpopular.
Right.
You know, and yeah, it's probably frustrating to the Republicans to lose the governor's seat for 4 years, but at the same time, Matt Bevin wasn't popular in his own party, and I would imagine a lot of Republicans are more than happy to see Andy Beshear have the governorship for 4 years, knowing that they're going to have a chance to nominate their person in 4 years, and, you know, absent something incredible or a ton of work from progressive people all across Kentucky, not a whole lot we can do.
Right. So this is a van life podcast.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that I really wanted to talk to you on it is because you really are in the trenches as far as, let me restart this real quick.
Yeah.
It's going to stop in a second. You really
do you do a video too?
Yeah, it goes up on YouTube and
cool.
and the podcast platforms and stuff. You really are in the trenches in terms of seeing the effects and implications of the lack of affordable housing, probably in several different stripes of communities. And I was talking to my buddy John earlier today, who, you know, he lives in a $100,000 van, which is not even a real expensive van, right? But what I've been having this conversation with several people lately, is like, there are, you know, yesterday at dinner we were talking about the difference between homeless and houseless and sheltered and unsheltered.
Right.
And, you know, there's a spectrum that's not a completely straight line, right? It's this cloud from unbelievably rich to just absolutely destitute and homeless, right? And for everybody who's not on one extreme end of that spectrum, the affordability of something influences your decision, right? You decide what to eat depending on how much money you have, or how many resources you have at your disposal. And even for John, who lives in a nice, big Mercedes van, you know, he and I are both totally employable and capable to have a brick and mortar home, but between the freedom and the cost savings, the decision to be in a van has influenced us to be the price, and the freedom matrix has influenced us, our decision to live in a van. And I'm always just like stressing out and thinking about parking, and the fact that we devote so much of our real estate in the United States to the free storage of people's unused private property.
Right.
So, what is the answer to getting people in homes? Mm-hmm. And I'm not even asking that question necessarily to the people with whom you work directly, right? Because they're the destitute have a different problem than a lot of the people who are in the van life community, who are electively living in vans or whatever. Right. But there's a problem that's influencing the variables that influence our decisions as people who live in vans, which is that there's just everywhere, and especially in Southern California, coastal Southern California, there is a booming population and less and less affordable housing. What's the answer to the regulatory dearth of affordable housing, and what's the answer to gentrification?
I'm going to tell you there's one answer, and we're going to tell it to you right after a word from our sponsor. Do you advertise on this?
No.
Well, put in an advertisement here. Sell
okay,
monetize this.
Yeah, buy an Instant Pot. They're fucking awesome. And if you get the small one, you can run it off a 1,000-watt inverter.
This YouTube video brought to you by Casper Mattress and Instant Pot.
Casper, I would have a hard time cutting that in half with a bread knife like I did with this one.
Mm-hmm.
They're too thick, probably.
I mean, we're putting it out there, Casper. Call us. Yeah, I joke because there's not obviously one answer to.
I thought it was going to be monosyllabic.
It's so easy. It's driven by a lot of things. I mean, obviously, your decision to live in a van is a cost-benefit analysis that takes into account the cost of owning a brick and mortar house.
Sure.
Right? Like, if the cost of that were less, this would look less attractive.
Sure.
Right? Although it does look very attractive.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. I think about this a lot. I got my start working at Legal Aid Society during the foreclosure crisis. And so, you learn a lot about housing policy and zoning and vacant and abandoned properties. I got a chance to learn a lot about that in the context of Louisville. And so, the forces that, empty out certain neighborhoods because of predatory lending during a foreclosure crisis are a lot different than, height restrictions or density restrictions or NIMBYs in Southern California, making it difficult to build the infrastructure necessary to have density, right? And build density affordably. So, I'm not an affordable housing expert. To me, part of it is, at least in Louisville, there doesn't seem to be a lot of infrastructure in place to allow variances for tiny homes or multifamily tiny homes, to build more density on vacant and abandoned property that's existent. You talked about parking. I'm very curious about what will happen to our downtowns. Louisville, according to City Streets
Blog.
Streets Blog.
Isn't that right?
Yeah.
I think, or City Lab. I think it was Streets Blog.
I think it was Streets Blog.
You guys lost the parking.
We won.
Oh, you won, which is being a loser.
Which is we were the best at being the worst.
Yeah.
For surface parking in a downtown metropolitan area. And it's true. I mean, there's just surface lots everywhere in Louisville. And, what does that look like if micromobility takes off, if ride sharing takes off, if we invest in public transit, in a massive way? What's possible in terms of building density back into downtown Louisville? It's a real opportunity as far as I'm concerned, with these new technologies, but I don't know whether people are having those conversations, or the city is taking the steps it needs to. I don't know. I'm not saying they're not. I'm just saying I don't know whether they're taking the steps they need to secure that land now, while it's just a surface lot, so that in 20 or 30 years, we've paid a pittance compared to what we can build on it in 20 or 30 years.
That's a great idea to try to acquire it now.
Yeah, get it now.
When it's just a big parking crater. Yeah.
Surface parking lot, and the micro-mobility stuff is just coming online.
What do you mean by micro-mobility?
Oh, one wheels, bird scooters, e-bikes, all of those technologies, new and old. My main hope for, e-bikes and birds and micromobility in general is like, I'm a person who loves to ride their bike. Can we leverage the increased demand for safe bike lanes that comes from boomers riding e-bikes, right? Millennials riding e-scooters. Those people want that infrastructure in the same way that I wanted to use a relatively old technology.
Right.
You know? And so I think there's just a huge opportunity for Louisville and cities like Louisville to do a lot of infill of affordable housing to create density in their downtown areas and just the suburbs right outside of, I mean, within 2 or 3 miles of downtown. In West Louisville, because it was the hardest hit area of the foreclosure crisis, there's a lot of vacant property, single family lots that could fit a new modestly built home, some tiny homes. All of those things are possible on those lots. But, you know, I'm a lawyer that's interested in affordable housing. I have a church community that's like asking me to like figure out the zoning and where they might be able to like put 4 tiny homes. What kind of conditional use permit would we need to get? All of that stuff. And I can't figure it out. And it doesn't seem like there's anybody at the city who's creating like the one pager that says, so you want to build a tiny home in Louisville.
Yeah.
Here's the steps.
Right.
Do you own property yet? Here's all the vacant property that the city owns. 300 lots, you know? Here are some designs that you might choose from, you know? All of those things that we could do to make the activation energy lower. Right. To catalyze some of the desire of people to, I mean, homeless and housing advocates would love to have some condensed or scatter plot affordable housing to use for emergency housing for people, where they could safely live in a tiny home and get stable and get their VA benefits established, get their SSI, like whatever they need to do to like start back into the world.
Yeah.
And I think there are just a ton of opportunities, but we have to have help from the policymakers to say, here's how we're going to do this. You know, here's how we can do infill in a way that increases density so that grocery stores come downtown.
Right.
So that, you know, more people are on the streets at night, so that more people feel safe, you know, downtown or whatever it might be, you know. Where are we going to have the van life lot?
Yeah.
We could definitely do that.
I've been reading Jane Jacobs lately, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And one of the things that really kind of broke my brain that she says is that, and it totally makes sense, but I just hadn't thought about it that way yet. You know, everybody growing up in rural South Carolina, the generalization or stereotype, whatever you want to call it, of New York is that it's a crazy, mean, and dangerous place. But then when I was in college, for some reason, I looked into the actual murder statistics. And the county that I grew up in, South Carolina's murder rate is way higher than New York City. It's just that there's a murder in New York City every day because of millions and millions and millions of people. Right. But you're way more likely to get shot in the face by somebody in Horry County, South Carolina. And one of the points that Jane Jacobs makes is that when you segregate uses and there's only legitimate activity going on for a certain block of the day in a given neighborhood, it becomes dangerous. Because if you want to go do some bad shit, you go to a residential neighborhood when everybody's at work, or you go to an industrial neighborhood in the middle of the night, you know, or one of the commercial neighborhoods.
I was going to say the commercial district at 4 a.m.
But if there's somebody who lives, if there's a bodega shop owner who's there 24 hours a day, in some, with his employees or whatever, that dude has a vested interest in making sure nothing bad's going on in the neighborhood because people will stop buying booze and eggs at his shop or whatever.
For sure.
And so having eyes on the street, if you believe that people are at least 51% more good than bad, having eyes on the street is free security, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's free and democratic security.
What we need is a panopticon.
What is that?
That's the surveillance state that Michel Foucault.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah.
The point of it is not whether you're being surveilled or not, but the possibility that you could be surveilled.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So if so those neighborhoods are mixed use neighborhoods are safer. Mm-hmm. This is the friendly panopticon, mm-hmm. right? Because it's not that that somebody's looking out their window at 3 p.m, but they could be.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's a retirement community mixed in with, a commercial district mixed in with whatever.
And if somebody pulls a musket on you in Horry County in the middle of nowhere and you scream, nobody's going to hear it. Mm. But if it's 3 p.m or 3 a.m. in a multi-use residential, commercial, industrial neighborhood and you scream at any time of the day, then you're going to have eyes on you.
Yeah.
So you're safer just by being able to call help. I'm going to shit on van life in a minute, but first I want to...
the podcast or van life generally?
Van life generally,
okay.
Because I don't think it's I don't think that it's a good thing. I don't think it's a systemic answer to any of our problems. It's individually, it works for people like me and John because we're like, okay, we can figure out a way to stay afloat financially. And this allows us, my van payment is a third of what my last apartment payment was.
Right.
And at the end of 5 years of a car loan, I'll own it outright. And so it's a wonderful solution for specific people, whether they're doing this cost benefit analysis like we're doing, or they have to have a place to be and all they've got is a car. Mm-hmm. But I don't know that it's a systemic solution to anything. The only reason that it works is because we have so much real estate dedicated to the free storage of people's private property. Otherwise this wouldn't make sense because especially in Southern California on the coast, camp spot costs $45 a night. Mm. And if I started doing that and paying my van payment, well, we're back up to the $1,800 I was paying for my last one bedroom.
Well, I mean, the way I would think about it is, or the way I'm thinking about it as we're talking in your van, Marty, it occurs to me that for a long time, we've had housing in America that's sort of... Did you take calculus? I'm not a math person, so you're talking to a lawyer, English major, talking about calculus now. But, when you're looking at a curve, the idea is you've got the more narrow you can make the bars to describe that curve, mm-hmm. the more accurate you are in describing that curve.
Sure.
And to me, in American housing, for a long time, we've had very wide bars.
Sure.
Where it's you have apartments, you have Section 8, you have, left to right, you have homeless, houseless population, you have Section 8, you have apartments, you have condos, you have single family dwellings, and these are big, broad chunks of rows mm-hmm. that don't very accurately trace the outline of the curve, mm-hmm. right? And what I think we ought to get to, whether van life is good or bad, I think what would be better for the lived experience of human beings is that those bars get narrower, mm-hmm. so that there are more options for people to choose from, and they can choose in that band from a number of different bars.
Sure.
And we as a society invest in the infrastructure that makes those decisions, like, to open a can of worms, not like a tragedy of the commons situation, right? So that we invest in a way that, like, we're internalizing the costs of those decisions in a way that makes sense, that recognizes that single family house dwellers are actually taking up a lot of resources, that everybody could be sharing and all of that. But we were talking last night about, what would it look like to actually bring trash cans and infrastructure to homeless camps, to camping spots, to vacant and abandoned property. So that we make it as easy for people who choose to live in a van or in a tent, or who don't choose,
right,
but have to live in a van or a tent, make it as easy for them to choose to use a trash can or, use the facilities as we do for people who live in single family
mansions or whatever.
Yeah. To mansions, right? But we've built our infrastructure in such a way that we assume people are going to live in one of these big bricks of columns.
Yeah, they're only
right?
3 or 4 columns.
3 or 4 columns. And what we ought to be doing is making it easier for people to move among those columns and having more columns, so that as you move through your life, you have the freedom to decide to live in a van for 6 months, for 6 years. And the cost of doing that is not so prohibitive, right? Like, you don't have to be from privilege to make that decision because it's the right choice for you and your family, given what job you have right now. Right. And I think also, I'm sure you talk about this, with your other folks, but I have a friend who's living that van life with his family. Yeah. I mean, it's the camper trailer life. Yeah. But he's an educational consultant, and he has two kids who are 8 and 10. And he and his wife travel around in their truck and camper.
Awesome.
Because he has a job that he can do remotely. And in fact, as a consultant, it's better for him. He can get jobs that he otherwise could not afford to take to work for 3 weeks in Portland. Well, are you going to leave the family back home? Are they going to put you up in a hotel? What does your contract with that nonprofit that you're consulting with look like when you say, just pay my per diem or pay me this much to do the thing? You don't even have to worry about lodging.
Right.
I'm a turtle.
Yeah.
I travel with my home on my back, and you become a more compelling hire for that job.
That specific.
And with the internet and with remote working and all of that, I think we're going to see, I think we as a society would benefit to make mobility and decisions that people want to make for where and how they live to be based on what's right for them and their family, not, is it a good investment?
Right.
Do I need to live here so that my kids can go to a good school? How many people are paying mortgages, and part of that mortgage payment is tuition payment to a public school that they want to send their kids to.
Yeah.
And the housing prices
almost everybody I know
artificially inflated because they want to get into the right school district. If you haven't read The 2-Income Trap by Elizabeth Warren, do it.
I haven't read that.
It's great. It blew my mind.
I want to talk about the tragedy of the commons in a minute. And I don't want you to be late to your event. But tiny homes.
Yeah.
I've asked a bunch of people this question, and it's not... I think... Yeah. Why tiny homes? It occurs to me... I was so into tiny homes 5 years ago or something. Because I realized that with my work ethic and ambition, I was never going to have enough money to buy a piece of land with an old crappy house in the community that I wanted to live in and take the 3 years off that I would need to build a house with my hands. I always wanted to do that. And that's what the van allowed me to do.
Yeah.
More than anything. Like, I loved building the stuff in this van and figuring it out and sorting out all the problems and stuff. I was super into tiny homes at the same time that I was living car free for political, ethical reasons. And what occurred to me about the tiny home thing is that because I think Durango, Colorado has a tiny home community that they've put in downtown recently. And it's sort of like one of the first like urban that's a small town, but first quasi-urban pilot projects for tiny homes. The thing to me about tiny homes is, for the most part, so far anyway, they're out in the boonies. And if you're gonna live in a 200 square foot tiny home and drive a 100 square foot car around to get from there to the grocery store and back, why not just put the tiny home in the car? Is sort of my idea, right? So that's why I'm van life instead of tiny home. And then if you're gonna have a tiny home in a place where there are actually other multiple use sort of multiple uses happening in the neighborhood. For example, if you could get an old parking lot in downtown Louisville or something and dedicate it to tiny homes, it just seems, from a building materials perspective and an energy consumption perspective, it just makes more sense to share walls and floors and ceilings.
Oh, for sure.
And build an apartment building instead.
For sure.
And it doesn't have to be one of your old, like, concentration camp Section 8 houses from Chicago or whatever, right? It can be like a nice, fair, affordable apartment building or whatever. But what's the allure of tiny homes to you? You've mentioned them a few times.
Yeah. Well, I think the difference between multiple story apartment complex and a tiny home is, like, you don't have to ask anybody's permission. Just from a
ownership, from an ownership perspective?
No, just from nobody has the resources to build an apartment building for them to live in. There is, from an organizing perspective, I can tell you, collective action is not an easy thing to accomplish. And building an apartment complex on a parking lot, or stringing together 6 or 7 vacant and abandoned lots in West Louisville, it takes a lot more coordination and legal authority to build an apartment complex than it does a tiny home. And so tiny homes are a right-sized problem for an individual's talent, ambition, legal acumen, and finances. Right? And so I don't disagree that, like, from a resources standpoint, from an affordability standpoint, share walls. Like, if we could build all of those apartments, do it. Right? But we can't wait. And we also can't do that alone. And so I think there's just a real allure for people to be able to say, just like you enjoyed building this out, to be able to say, what would it look like to live in 500 square feet?
I want a micro plot.
Where would my daughter sleep?
Yeah.
And so, you can log on to Netflix and find any number of documentaries about the allure of tiny homes.
Oh, I've watched a shit ton of them.
Yeah. But, and I think all of the reasons are very individual, but for a lot of folks, I think it is one of these understandings that, we're not around for very long. And in the same way that I was able to afford to take a job at Legal Aid Society because I graduated with very little student loan debt, and a lot of people who graduated ahead of me in law school, like, literally couldn't even afford the privilege of applying to work at Legal Aid. And that set my life on the course that I'm on now, just because I could afford to take a job that other people couldn't afford.
You could afford to not make a shit ton of money.
Exactly. No, it's all privilege. Right? And that gave me a special skill set that came out of the foreclosure crisis that allowed me to do the work that I've done since leaving Legal Aid. And so I think a lot of people look at what is the work that I want to do on this planet, and what am I willing to sacrifice in order to be able to do it? And tiny homes are a pretty good sacrifice.
Yeah.
In terms of, I mean, I say sacrifice because people are saying I'm not going to do my consulting job for the ad agency anymore. I'm going to stop selling toothpaste to people during the Super Bowl and just work with nonprofits. But in order to do that, got to downsize my budget. And so I think that's part of it. I think obviously affordability is a huge problem for seniors as well. Like having a place that you can put in the back of your son-in-law's backyard. You know, I think I'm very interested in, you know, what do they call it? Accessory dwelling units. Yeah. And getting that in place in Louisville.
We just got a couple of years ago Encinitas, the town where we live, just really sort of across the board was like, go for it.
Go for it.
Just because we've been such an abject failure in terms of
it solves so many problems, from affordable housing for students to senior care for people who can live independently, but also you would like to check in on them or make sure that your dad's taking his medications every day. Like, what a great solution. Like, go for it. So anyway, I think just like van life, tiny homes are something, it's
just another notch on the x-axis. Right?
Yeah,
that you're talking about under your parabola.
Yeah. And the same way that we need to reduce the barriers for people to build accessory dwelling units, like we need to reduce that energy that people need to expend to make those bands of housing smaller and make the costs of moving from one band to another lower. Right?
Yeah. Let me do this one more time, and I'm going to let you go in just a minute. But you mentioned it earlier, and you've studied it way more than me. Describe the tragedy of commons and tell me how we fix it.
Oh, do you do show notes to this?
Like links and shit?
Yeah.
I'm happy to.
Okay.
Yeah. You say it now, and then I'll know to put it in the description of the video.
And if Marty doesn't do it, if there's not a link to this Courier Journal column, comment in the comments and call him out.
Tell all of your friends to subscribe to the podcast, and they can all complain too.
That's right. That's right. Hit the like and subscribe, folks. So, I wrote a column about this a few years ago, for our local paper, the Louisville Courier Journal, and in the column itself, I described the behavior that creates the tragedy of the commons as jackassery. It's basically abusing a common resource. So the tragedy of the commons was this. I don't even know who wrote it. I understand he's problematic now from some perspective. There's a recent article. We'll have to link to both the tragedy of the commons and this article called The Tragedy of the Tragedy of the Commons, because whoever wrote the article has some problematic political views. I haven't read the article. But anyway, the basic notion is when you have a common resource, people have a economic incentive to use that resource to their own individual advantage.
Nestle pulling the water out in Florida.
Water is a great commons. In the article, I basically said, I don't care if high school graduates know anything else. If there's an exit exam where to graduate high school, you have to be able to identify commons and articulate ways that we could protect those commons from abuse, exploitation by people. I'm fine with you graduating from high school.
Right.
Like if you know nothing else, you're ready to be a good citizen, because it's like, what triggered it for me was like there was a guy who had taken up 2 parking spots in the Home Depot parking lot. And it's like, my dude, just pull through, you know? And it's that kind of behavior that, that's abusive.
Yeah.
And it's selfish and also at the same time, completely understandable. It's not his parking lot. It doesn't cost him anything to park like a jackass, except for maybe, hopefully, some public shame.
Right.
You know? So anyway, the commons are everywhere once you start looking for them. And, you know, it's all of the things that comedians are fodder over, right? The way people drive.
Right.
The obviously our parks and roadways and things like that. But even deeper than that, it can be, I'm blanking right now, Marty, on all of the different commons, but.
Well, air is a very obvious one, right?
Any shared resource, right? But it's even, I mean, you can look at digital commons as like, you know, what is it? What does cyberbullying look like? Or, what are some of the other commons? I'm sorry, you guys. Read the column. So in the column, I identify basically like 3 ways that you can, regulate, common spaces.
Okay.
And it's essentially like you can privatize it. So that, like, for example, in your office fridge, that's a commons.
Right.
You could divide it up so that
This side of the shelf's mine.
Rita has this quadrant, Marty has this quadrant,
Yeah.
and Stephanie keeps her celery down here, right? And you could sell those spots
Sure.
to the highest bidder. That's sort of like how carbon trading works, right? Selling the right to pollute as a commons. But one of the key regulatory areas is shame, which I think is one of the most dangerous parts about the shamelessness of our politics these days, as we break down norms and people are less immune to community scorn.
More immune, you mean?
More immune. Thank you. You know, it's more likely that people leave their dog poop on the sidewalk.
Right.
Right? Because if you're not ashamed of that, what's it matter to you?
Right.
Or you can regulate it. I mean, you could fine people or all of those things.
Right.
Right.
And we sort of do most of all of those things.
Yeah, you basically have a menu of 3 different things that you can do to regulate commons.
So, I mean, private real estate ownership is interesting to me because I don't know if you've read Henry George, but his Poverty in Progress is like one of my favorite books. It was this journalist that wrote a book called Poverty in Progress in like 1895 or something like that, and he sort of tried to trace the fact that he recognized that as the Industrial Revolution was happening, progress, the curve of progress and poverty, which he defined as able-bodied, willing to work people who can't make enough money to make a living. Poverty increased on roughly the same curve as progress. And the thing that he ultimately tied it to was the ability of private parties to leverage the power of ownership of real estate. Because if you look at the New World, North America, and let's dispose of the problem of the people who were already here for 15,000 years. But if you
we've already disposed of it.
Yeah. Oh God, that's still too soon.
Yeah.
If there was actually a place that was uninhabited, and your family moves out there, you're gonna set up shop on the shipping corridor because it's got water and mobility there. But you have to make all your food and shoes and house and all of that stuff just within your family. As more people come to the area, they're able to benefit of your establishment of this place. And now you've got a cobbler and a cook and a blacksmith. And eventually your great grandkids are able to move out to the suburbs, but keep ownership of the most valuable piece of property in town and quit being productive members of society because they're leveraging this real estate value. And, you know, I mean, to the extreme, you can go, oh, that's that's totally communist and common ownership of everything. But our private property tax structure basically acknowledges that problem, right? You have to pay property tax even if you own a place outright because you own it and it's worth something. And you should have to pay back to the community at large for having that leverage. I guess that's all of that in a way is me saying that, like, the house that the piece of property that your house is on is the commons too. Mm-hmm. Even though you own it, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that would be one of those situations where, as a community, we've decided to regulate the commons by dividing it up.
Selling it to you.
Selling it.
But still charging you for it. Mm-hmm. Right? That's part of the regulatory thing.
And obviously there are things that I can't do with that property. I can't put an aluminum smelting plant on my property.
Yeah, sure.
You know?
Sure.
So,
your ownership is not completely unfettered.
Right.
This occurred to me when you were talking about the exit exam from
high school. And I just, because I didn't frame it in terms of the tragedy of commons, but I had this breakdown, like my middle of my second semester in law school, because I'm a slacker. And I went to Davidson and did some work and graduated, but I worked really hard at hanging out and learning stuff from my friends. But I didn't do a whole lot of making good grades on your tests, you know? And then I went to law school and I was like, I'm gonna fucking do this. And I'm gonna read everything. And I did until about the second half of the second semester. I had this wonderful, just wonderful beacon of light. Did you hear about the lady who wore a Black Lives Matter t-shirt to her class, and her students wrote her letter about how inappropriate it was, and she graded it as if it was a legal writing paper? She like blew up the internet for a couple of days, like 3 years ago. This woman was my mentor in law school, and I went in so mad one day to her office hours, and I'm like, Patricia, why are we fucking speaking Latin? I'm like, look, all we're studying, I was in her criminal law class at the time, but I took everything she taught. She taught constitutional law, and she was our big feminism professor and that stuff. And, looked like, one of the teachers from Hogwarts or something. She wore a gown to class every day. She's awesome. A Black Lives Matter gown.
I'm sure she put the shirt over her gown. But I was like, why are we doing this? Here's the deal. And this is why I'm pissed off. Is that, everything that we're talking about here is purely just a matter of competing interests. Whether it's competing interests of governments or individuals. I kick you in the shin, I hurt you, it caused you some damage, and now I owe you for the damage that I caused to you. Mm-hmm. You can explain that to a 15-year-old of average intellect super easily, right? And the fact that we don't is a fucking crime against our society. And that rant came out, and she told me about the natural language movement that they had in the 70s to make the law more accessible to people. And I just wanted to get your feedback on that idea, because that seems very similar to your wish for a tragedy of the commons exit exam for high school. What do you think are the barriers? Is it really too hard, or are the old boys trying to keep the club exclusive and profitable? Why aren't we teaching equity to our children?
Those are some big questions. Do you mean like why are governments not creating like how-to guides for tiny home stuff, or is it more why are we not explaining our legal system in basic terms?
Why are we not explaining our legal system in basic terms? And why isn't there... That question almost seems subsumed in the bigger question of where is the critical thinking element in our education?
Oh.
And I wanted to ask you that question because I feel like you probably have a unique perspective on it, having worked in legal aid and legal aid-ish jobs for so long. Because that's what you're doing, basically, right? It's giving the sophistication to people who need it but don't have it.
Yeah, we're trying to explain an obtuse, obscure system to people.
Right.
And explaining why this case is going to take 6 months when they need the money
yesterday.
Yeah, like they need their security deposit back yesterday. Like they needed it to get another apartment, and their landlord kept it. And here's the process that we've created to resolve these, and it's going to take a while. I don't know how to answer that, Marty. I think in our educational movement, there are people that are interested in problems-based solution, like problems-based education and sort of like cross-pollinating, disciplines and getting people to address, like learn the skills on how to do presentations with like real problems, right? By giving them problem sets to work on. But yeah, I don't know about the critical thinking specifically. It's when you try to explain how the law works to people, it often comes down to like, that's just the way we've done it, you know, which is obviously unsatisfying. And yet, you know, I told somebody the other day, the law is the only industry in America where creative is used as a pejorative.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's what's nice about being at these conferences and being with people who are thinking critically about what does a SNAP notice look like? What's the best practice in communicating complicated eligibility hurdles, like all of the systems that you have to go through to qualify for SNAP? Like, how do we communicate that in plain language? It's not easy, and there, you know, the law specifically, because it's married to precedent, because it's overworked, you know, the justice system, and underfunded in terms of people's ability to afford counsel. There's just a lot that goes unremedied.
Yeah.
We were lucky enough to do a case. I told you about the case we did for the woman who had $2,500 stolen, in my opinion, from her by an employer. After she'd worked there for 2 months and been paid $2,500, she worked a third month, and at the end the guy said, "You're not producing, so we're not going to pay you anymore." And she said, "Are you going to pay me for the last month of work I did?" He said, "No." That took 9 months to take to trial, and we tried to do it as a small claims matter, and the only reason why we were able to represent her is because we're a nonprofit. And the facts sort of pissed me off. But like, that's not a case that our legal system is structured to address.
To allow for.
Like private employment attorneys cannot take that case. Legal aid cannot take that case because it's outside of their priorities. And she probably doesn't qualify income wise, you know, for legal aid. And so that's just an injustice that doesn't get addressed most of the time. But I don't think that small time nickel and diming injustice, obviously $2,500 isn't nickel and diming, but when it comes to the justice system, it is. I mean, it's literally a small claims. That's the limit of a small claims complaint that you can file in Kentucky, right? So it's literally a small claims. And it's just not something that we're set up to address.
Over $2,500 is not small claims court anymore in Kentucky?
Mm-mm.
Oh, wow. It's $10,000 here.
Yeah.
Well, shit. Yeah. And I mean, I've actually been in that boat. I had an employer not pay me, and I went to the labor board and got a $5,000 judgment against them, and I never saw that money. And I talked to a couple of attorneys, and they were like, yeah, it's just not enough money. Like,
yeah,
you can't find the money. I can, but it's going to cost me $15,000 of work to do it. Mm-hmm. And so that's just out there.
And the problem with that, of course, is landlords, employers, contractors, like they all know that if you're within $0 to $1,500, $2,500, it's people are busy. We live short lives, and we have a lot of competing interests for our time. To track down a lawyer, to pay a lawyer, to find out whether you qualify for legal aid or not, it's too much. And so it's just a ripe area for abuse. And it happens all the time. And our system for delivering justice and reconciling those disputes is broken because in this case, we tried to do it the easy way. The way that our justice system has set up. You have a dispute worth less than $2,500. You don't even need an attorney. We're going to fast track your case. We're going to give you a quick trial to find out. Let me see the picture of the contract. The notes that your employer took while you were negotiating an oral contract. Let me see the picture of that. Right? And I'll make a decision on whether he owes you the $2,500 or not. Maybe we get it right. Maybe we get it wrong. But it's going to be over. And you don't have to spend a bunch of money on an attorney. We tried to do it that way. They counterclaimed for $4,400 and removed it to district court so that it took a lot longer to do. And yet, my client's just going to get the $2,500 it should have gotten back in February. It's frustrating.
Well, I look up to you immensely for the stuff that you're doing, because I wish that I had the stomach and perseverance to.
It's all privilege,
to
baby.
take on that giant. Yeah, but I'm using my privilege in a much more indulgent, self-indulgent
False.
way.
Fake news. Come on.
All right, man. Get to your thing.
Okay.
Thank you for doing this.
Thanks
I had
for
a
having
really
me
good
on.
time picking your brain.
Again, this has just Ben and Marty talking in a van.
All right, guys, we did it. That was episode 36 of From the Van, featuring Ben Carter. It was so good to catch up with him, man. I feel really fortunate to have seen him 2 times already this year. Super good guy. I look up to him for the work that he's doing. I think that he's doing great work. He's very capable and also super passionate about it, which is really good. So I hope that you enjoyed it. Thank you so much if you're still listening. I appreciate you for making it this far. And come back next Tuesday for another episode of From the Van.